I'm new to podcasting. I love the medium and I really enjoy having conversations like this. And I want to get better at it. The only way to do that is to get real, honest feedback. And you get feedback from people actually listening to your show and telling you what you can do better.
Most hosts never achieve the results they hoped for. They're falling short on listenership and monetization, meaning their message isn't being heard and their show ends up costing them money. This podcast was created to help you grow your listenership and make money while you're at it. Get ready to take notes. Here's your host, Adam Adams.
Welcome back to the podcast on podcasting. It's your host, Adam, AAA Adams, and we've got another AA or AAA, Alex Atwood, a client of ours. We've been working with him. He's got an amazing podcast called Off the Clock. Potentially might be rebranding. Not sure if that'll come out on this podcast, but I want to get into his journey, what he did right, what he did wrong. And also, he's got some really good advice that we can talk about. So if you're about to start a podcast, he's got a couple things for you. And if you have a podcast, but you're looking to make it better, he's got a couple other things for you as well. Generally, I don't go through anybody's bio on the podcast because that's already in the show notes. You can scroll down, you can check him out. The podcast is Off the Clock, and we'll make sure that the link is in the show notes so you can scroll down, connect with him, check it out. If you love it, give him a rating and a review and let him know that you heard about him here. What's going on, Alex? How are you today?
Hey, Adam Adams, how are you? So
Adam
good to
Adams.
see you. I love saying your name too.
Right? In school, when I grew up, everybody had to call me by my full name. It was just a thing. So,
well,
you're
it
not
rolls
the
off
only
the
one.
tongue. It's Alex Atwood, Adam Adams. It's
Yeah.
good. We're always first in line.
Yes, 100%. Except for Jessica Abel.
Oh, yeah.
She got in front of me and it drove me nuts. I'll say that much. Alex, so you started a podcast, Off the Clock. Would love to hear the reason why you decided to start that podcast. Like, what was kind of going through your mind? Was it that somebody was telling you to do it? Did you have a gut feeling you should?
Well,
What was going on?
yeah. So first of all, I thought there was a lot of relevant content that I would be able to provide to people interested in either the entrepreneurial journey, specific to small business, and more specifically to managing your resources, your teams. And I have like a long background in staffing and human resources and hiring, and I've seen it evolve from when I started in the late 90s, early 2000s to today with different generations having different motivations in terms of why they do things. And I've always kind of worked with the hourly employee, a lot of the line level employees in the businesses that I've been in. And so I felt that I could provide some insight to people that are either new into the corporate world. Now they have to manage teams of people, and how do they do that, and how do they get people to work together well, and how do they establish like peer-to-peer relationships, things like that. And I also wanted to get into the journey of the person that I'm talking to. So really understanding their background, how they got to where they are. I've had the opportunity to talk to some pretty cool entrepreneurs, to some people that are just doing some very cool things. So in the conversation about managing their teams, I learn a lot about them.
One thing that I've noticed just with my podcast is there's always these hidden benefits. So I started asking guests when they come on the show, hidden benefits that you may have seen that maybe you didn't expect when you were starting a podcast. Is there anything you can think of that is growing your business, growing you as a person, etc., that came as a result of the podcast, but that wasn't like your first thought?
Yeah. Okay. Well, there's a few things. First, it's interesting to learn more about the topics that you're exploring from a different perspective. So I have my own perspective as I'm going into these conversations. And as I'm asking these questions and understanding how people view leadership and how people view empowering others and things like that. So it's pretty fascinating what I'm gleaning from the conversations. But in terms of just having a podcast and something that has been sort of a value that I didn't expect, I think it's being able to watch myself actually broadcast and to be able to see where I can make improvements, to be able to just stomach myself and hearing my own voice and watching myself, and then sort of having a different perspective of me, almost like a self-analysis, but not so much in a critical way. I've been able to feel a little bit more empowered about my voice, be a little bit more self-expressed. And that was something that I didn't necessarily expect. I think I got into it to be able to have something that would showcase and provide content that's synergistic with my business and what my expertise is. But I think what I discovered out of it is that you can sort of expand yourself. You can sort of expand yourself and expand your self-expression and all of that and start to pull things out you didn't even realize that you were capable of.
Yeah. Awesome. Thank you for sharing. Curious as well if there were any roadblocks, any concerns for you starting a podcast? And if there were, how did you overcome them to get to where you are?
Yeah, so I think the roadblock I had was that I had never done it before. And so to me, not having done something and taking it on and doing it in a way that is appealing, in a way that actually gets people to want to listen and actually puts out like a good product, had me go out and actually do a lot of the research that I needed to do, understand what it takes to actually put a podcast on the air, what sort of questions are more compelling, and more importantly, how can I be in the moment with my guest and really have sort of almost a breakthrough in the conversation, like understand more than the transactional level stuff that you hear so much of in podcasts. So did I answer your question? I think I kind of jumped
you're really doing a great job.
Yeah.
And you're making me curious. I assume that the listener is pretty curious too, because it's that you're mentioning that it was a challenge to start a podcast. And some of those things were the questions that you would ask and how do you really bring that to light. But I think that the listener's starting to think like, well, give us that sweet sauce. What have you learned specifically that has helped you to be able to take that value out of that conversation that you're having with your guest?
Yeah, so that's well put. So you go into each podcast with a structure in place that allows you then to be able to actually be in the conversation, right? You have sort of the general topics of the conversation already laid out. You've already discussed that with the guest beforehand. So going into the conversation now, it allows you to be sort of in a dance with whoever you're having a conversation with. It allows them to feel comfortable in the conversation, and it allows you to be able to explore and guide the conversation to where you want it to go, which I think is important if you want people to listen to your show. You want them to be engaged, and you want them to hear more than necessarily statistics or why XYZ company can build a better widget or things like that. I think it really behooves our listeners to be able to understand why and to be able to understand the nuance behind why certain people make the decisions that they make.
In order to do that, is it more of like a follow-up question for you? Is it that they might say that they created a widget?
Yeah.
And then you just simply ask, just why did you create that? How did this come about? Or am I making it too simple?
Well, no. So I'm just interested in, so tell me why it is exactly that, like what led you to thinking that widget was something that you wanted to devote time to? Are you enjoying developing the widget? Where do you see this widget going? And how does your evolution as a professional business person, whatever that you do, how does your evolution and sort of your path work with the path of the widget, right? So how is it, like, what is it about you and your team that make you want to be passionate about making these widgets? And where do you see the evolution of these widgets? And to me, that's more interesting than just talking about sort of the production of the widget or, what makes the widget. I really want to know what this widget is, first of all.
I know, I'm really curious as well.
But anyway, go ahead.
My takeaway that I'm getting, and correct me if I'm wrong, it sounds like how you've felt you're able to grow a podcast conversation that is going to be helpful, valuable, and interesting for a listener, which is really one of the main goals, is that you have to genuinely be interested in the thing, so much so that these questions almost naturally come out. Because I think it would be so tough to dive deep like that if you didn't care. So it's almost like you've got to come into the podcast with a curious mind. Is that sounding accurate? Does that sound helpful for our listener?
Absolutely. And the more research you do about whoever you're talking to, not just research that's available on the web, but building forms that really get into what matters to whoever you're talking to. And that will then allow the conversation to flow, because now you're understanding what matters to them and you're talking about that, and that will light somebody up.
What do you mean by building forms?
Well, what you want to do is you want to go in and you want to use like an application like Google Docs, Google Forms, and you want to just have some simple forms about what are some topics that they feel they are very knowledgeable in, what do they enjoy talking about. You want to ask them, you kind of give them an idea of what your show is about and what your theme is and how they feel that they can contribute to that theme. And so when you're going into the conversation, you already sort of have your outline there, right? So now you're talking to them a little bit more, exploring prior to even hitting record. You're exploring the topic, you're exploring the conversation, and now you can kind of get what really is lighting them up about the conversation. And then you can just ask them, just be straight up, hey, are you okay if we discuss this? And get their green light and then sort of go for it.
Yeah. You know what? I don't think that I necessarily have a form or a good form or a great onboarding process. And so I feel like I'm missing out, which means that I'm probably going to record another episode just soon after this one, and I'll instruct the team to just have them go side by side. So I'm going to do as much research as I can about building forms. We might even create some type of template for the listener so that they can have them.
Are you being sarcastic?
No,
Adam?
I literally, honestly, sincerely am feeling like I'm missing out. I'm like, oh my gosh, I need a form. This makes so much sense. And I want my listener to have a form as well. So I know I'm being authentic.
Okay. All right. Yeah, no, I gotcha. And, like for me personally, having structures around whatever I do is important. Like if I have a podcast coming up, then I want to allocate time prior to the podcast, usually at least the day before, sometimes the day of, just to go through all my notes around that guest, go through what the potential questions are, like just go through that so that I have some things to talk about. And a lot of the times I'll talk about something I'll want to bring something up that isn't necessarily something any people who know the person necessarily know right away. So that will also be a topic of conversation. And a lot of the times when you have like an entrepreneur, CEO or whatever, right, a manager, whatever, they're so focused on having conversations about what they're doing in their business or for work and all of that, that they leave out a lot of information about themselves that probably informs a lot about what they do in their professional lives, right? So if I can dig some of that out, then somebody listening to it will say, I relate to that. Yeah, I do that. Oh, I play guitar. And I remember when I learned how to play guitar, I'm making this up, but I remember when I learned how to play guitar, I had to take 10 minutes just to tune up. And then I had to play 3 hours, 3 times a week just before so when you start to learn that about a guest, you start to learn, oh, okay, well, that's where they got their sort of ability to be able to do X, Y, Z. So it's not always straightforward, just like life, right? It just zigzags.
What's one example of you that might be beneficial in this conversation? Like, are you into mountain biking? Are you into wine? Are you into retreats? Are you into something that kind of is that next level for our conversation today?
Well, I'm into transformational work. So one thing that about 5 years ago, I put myself into a weekend that I heard was going to be extremely transformational. So let me back up a little bit. So I went through a pretty rough breakup and I was heartbroken and I had all these expectations for this relationship to evolve into a marriage or, all of that. And suddenly it all went away. And so a friend of mine said, go to this program. I won't mention the program, not that anything's wrong with it. It's called Landmark. It's a great program. It's something that is kind of similar to Tony Robbins and some of these other programs that are out there where you devote yourself to a weekend. And my friend told me that this weekend will be transferred. Like you'll go in one way, you'll come out another. I'm like, okay. To me, that I was sold. I'm like, if I can in a weekend get out of this heartbreaking situation that I'm in, like get rid of this heartache and come out just without this aching heart, I'll be fine. So I went to this weekend and just through lots of conversations and learning about how all of us in terms of like people are going through very similar journeys, almost identical journeys, and how leadership and empowerment and all that really works from the inside. That changed me, that transformed me. And I came out of this weekend like, wow, there was just so many possibilities available for me. So I did a lot of work around transformational things like NLP, things like yoga, and I started to move more and more into that. And I started to learn about the potential for psychedelics. I had a really good friend of mine that contacted me. I had known him for years, and he was a startup founder, and he went through an exit, went through the corporate world, and then he started to get really kind of woo-woo. And I would always get these emails from him about just different interesting things, different interesting organizations he was in, and they were doing things like plant medicines and doing things that are like gene keys and breath work and all this stuff that sounded interesting, a little far out, but cool. So I ended up on one of his retreats, and it was a 7-day retreat in Costa Rica. And we did all types of things. We did a lot of meditation, a lot of breath work. We had 3 nights of drinking ayahuasca. And that experience completely transformed the way that, well, it transformed so many things about me, but it transformed, like, the major thing that it sort of woke me up to was just how much, like, my insides, like how much I was taking on all of the things that were going outside of me, like my business and all that. And I was just absorbing all of that, and how I could stabilize myself internally through things like my breath and things like conversations. And it sounds woo-woo, but now I think it's almost like there's a new awakening that's happening here through these plant medicines. And so I've become very excited about what I feel is a new way of approaching things like mental health, problems like anxiety, empowerment. I learned that thousands and thousands of years across multiple cultures, entheogens and plant medicines and things like that have been part of rituals that have been rites of passage for so many people. And as they say, it takes a village to raise a child. There's so much love and warmth in those types of ceremonies and rituals, and just gatherings of human beings and people getting together and sharing vulnerably with each other. And all of that is just so powerful. And I think we've lost a lot of that in modern day times, but it's just so natural to us. When we're there, it's just like, this is what it's about. And once you are there, it's very difficult for you to come back into the transactional world and take it as seriously. And by that, I mean just being so serious. Because ultimately, every moment that goes by is a moment that is taking us closer to our graves. And once we really get present to that, things just open up. And that might sound woo-woo, but I hope that I'm expressing like just how much that sort of changed me. So that there's a residue from all of those, from this work that I'm doing, that proliferates through my conversations and through whether it's a podcast, whether it's a business meeting, all of that. It has me foster, like, relationships are very important to me, and they've taken a front seat behind capitalism in a way. And enjoyment is very important to me. And so my barometer goes from how profitable this is and how enjoyable this is, and enjoying it is more important than profiting from it. Because ultimately, time, there is no like price necessarily to put on time if you really look at it.
Alex, badass. I love it.
Really?
Now I want to be woo-woo. No, that's so interesting to me. That's so interesting. Yeah. My uncle does a lot of like breath work and fasting. Do fasting too?
Yeah. It all lives in the same world, honestly. Just something as simple as breathing in certain ways, sometimes pretty intense ways, can bring, like, if you do it daily or even if you do it once, it can really bring about a change. And I've done a lot of reading around that and found that that's pretty fascinating. Like, you don't have to go into the jungle or on the top of a mountain and drink vine juice. You can just sit and take on some breathing techniques and you'll go to the same place. And it's very healthy, by the way, much more healthy than what most people do when they want to unwind.
Have you heard of a breatharian before? Like people that say they don't really eat?
Yeah, is that a real thing?
I don't know, because I studied it a little bit and I saw like a whole bunch of people that do it. And some of them, they eat one meal a week and they call themselves like a breatharian. Some of them like will drink around 500 calories a day and call themselves a breatharian. But there are some people that swear they haven't eaten in 40 years or 20 years or 4 years or 2 years. And so it's just like, it's fascinating. We won't delve too deeply into breatharianism, but I just think it's interesting. Like, my uncle does all the control pauses. He's fasting. He's telling me I need to do this, do that. He doesn't work out at the gym so much anymore. He used to be like yoked. Like, my uncle was just a giant. 6'2" and 240 pounds of muscle. And now he's much thinner, and he says he's just way healthier. And he doesn't really spend that much time. But let's move on. Let's move on to podcasting, even though this is super interesting. I like how I learned from you, not necessarily how some of these plant medicines and breathing exercises can benefit our life, but the takeaway of how each and every one of our guests are remarkable in their own way, and they have their own way of looking at the world. And some of the things that they're into will end up being part of their podcast, their business, how they treat people, how they treat themselves. And that it is truly interesting to bring that about on a podcast episode. So that was super value in and of itself. The things that you said makes me want to do a 2-day and a 7-day. I want to try all this stuff and just grow as a human, because I think it's just awesome. I want to get to a couple of questions that we kind of talked about even before we started this episode today. We discussed how there was a few things that you mentioned that I knew a brand new podcaster needs to hear, and it would help somebody who hasn't really launched yet to be able to grow. You gave a few good examples to me, and I'd like to bring that out. And additionally, some information that could help somebody who's kind of in their journey of the podcast. They've already started it, but they want to develop it a little bit better.
Yeah. So what I would say baseline, what I learned, not having done any of this before, is that baseline, you want to make sure that the equipment that you're using, the audio, the video, all of the aesthetics are of high quality. So you want to make sure that that is there. And I didn't necessarily learn that right away. I went out, and when I first started a podcast, I think this is before I met you, I thought, well, I could just get the app. It says you can use it for a podcast. I'll get it. And realized there's just such a difference between high quality equipment and high quality visual. That difference really means a lot. There's a big impact there. So that's sort of baseline, what I would put out there, what I learned. And then secondly, it's sort of what we had talked about earlier, is that once you have your equipment, once you know that you have high quality audio, once you know that you're listenable, like people actually want to listen to you, and you start to get comfortable with being behind a microphone, then secondly, you just want to be able to structure out your day. So you want to put together a calendar on when you're recording your podcast. So you want to be able to do that. You want to have structures in place to record, to brainstorm. You really want to understand ultimately what the theme of your podcast is. So who is listening to you or who is watching you? Who is that person? So make that person three-dimensional, make that person a human being. What do they want to hear? And then once you have identified that person, and now you have quality audio, you have quality video, and you're comfortable, then you can just add the ingredient of having relevant topics, starting to ask questions that are open-ended, like really listening, like an active listening to your guest. What I've found is if you are listening for an answer to your question or listening to find a time to ask the next question, then it's going to be clear to the person listening or hearing you that you're not actually engaged in actually listening to the conversation. So it's very gestalt. When you're in a conversation with someone, you're not thinking about the next question you're going to ask them, because if you're thinking about that, you're not actually listening to what the answer is coming out. So that's key. Once you have your structures in place, then it's just a matter of you just being in the conversation, listening, and when you're hearing kind of fading away, you want to interject and you want to make sure that you're cognizant of the fact that somebody's listening to this conversation, and you don't want to start droning on and on and on. And that's one of the things, and I may be doing that now, but that's one of the things that I've heard in a lot of podcasts. A guest will drone on and on and on, and I'll say, it's time to switch off this podcast, right? Because that conversation is not that interesting anymore. It was when he started it 10 minutes ago, but now he's kind of elaborating too much. So I think as a host, you want to make sure that you have the feel of your listener present in the conversation.
One of the things that you said is difficult for me. There's got to be some type of balance between what active listening truly is and being prepared for the next question.
Me too.
I don't know, what is the right answer there? Because I always want to be prepared with the next question. I don't want to have awkward pauses, for example. And so that stress, that pressure that's on my heart of ensuring that it's a smooth conversation versus like listening and taking it all in. I think that there's absolutely got to be some healthy balance that we've got to figure out, like how to kind of do both as a host. You know what I mean?
I do. Well, who's your favorite interviewer? Like, who do you enjoy when they do an interview, either listening to the radio or watching TV?
There is a guy named Joe Fairless that I've focused on. He has a real estate podcast, and I listened to many different podcasts as I was about to start my original real estate investing podcast that I sold like almost 2 years ago. But there were a lot of people that I followed, and some of them I felt like they did a lot too much in my liking of just banter. No real true value, no real true point. And those episodes ended up going like an hour and a half, or even 2 hours long. And when I turned it off, I felt like I only had 5 minutes of value. And so I got frustrated. Joe he got to know the person a little bit, and then he took a break and went into his, what is the best advice ever? Basically, he would ask. And it seemed like if the episode was about 20, 25 minutes, that I got like 20, 25 minutes of value. So he's kind of the one that I would say that I look up to the most. I think he's really, really good at it, but I don't know if he gets deep into like personal things with people.
Right. So it sounds like you're listening to a podcast to be able to get real relevant information that you can act on. Like you want to get value out of that podcast right away and get insight from it. Yeah, then that makes sense. And I think if that's the theme of the podcast, then asking that question around advice, because that's what I heard when he really focuses on the advice side of things, then that's of amazing value. For me, I find since I was a little kid, I listened to Howard Stern. I've always been a huge Howard Stern fan. I've just loved, literally, I grew up in DC when Howard Stern was in DC in the 80s. And I remember hearing his voice, and I remember hearing how natural he sounded. And he sounded just like he was having a conversation on the street with somebody. And it was so compelling. And then when I started to watch the show, I realized how much work went into that. Like he did a ton of research, and he did a ton of like brainstorming with his teams to understand so much about the guest. So in order for it to be so casual and so laissez-faire, he had to do all the work going into the interview to be able to make it so casual. So I suppose just sort of growing up on that is why I feel that's why I kind of take the approach that I do. But I mean, I'm new to podcasting. I love the medium. I love and really enjoy having conversations like this. And I want to get better at it. And the only way to do that is to get feedback, is to get real, honest feedback. And you get feedback from people actually listening to your show and telling you what you can do better. And so I think I would put that in, if you're starting out in podcasting or starting out putting video podcasts out there, take a few of the recordings that you have, even if they're published or not, and share them, and get feedback around them. And I think that'll allow you to, when you get constructive feedback, it'll allow you to grow and be able to improve. And I think that's key.
Good stuff. A couple of takeaways for new aspiring podcasters that I got from what you mentioned. A, having quality equipment, good video, good audio is more important than you believe many people take a look at it. And I actually do agree. I think that quality audio, quality video, if you're going to be producing something, having something of good quality really supports it. I like the part about active listening, although I don't think I'm going to ever be perfect at it, versus not really worrying about that next question, not really worrying about the direction that you already intend the podcast to go, but to kind of let it organically get to a really healthy, valuable place. That's a really interesting insight, and I think it'll benefit me and the listener. You did mention, I want to talk about being comfortable behind the mic after I mention these other two things. You did mention understand the show, understand the direction of the show, understand the purpose of the show, understand the listener. And you went into some good detail on how important it is to have those things top of mind when you're creating content. And I couldn't agree more. And that last piece of feedback about getting that last piece of advice about getting feedback from potential listeners, whether it's published or not yet published, is something that sounds scary, but I could definitely see how spending that extra time can really help you be better at your craft. I want to get to this piece, though, where you said being comfortable behind the mic. It sounds as though like at some point you were less comfortable behind the mic, or that you know some podcasters that aren't comfortable behind the mic. And so I want to just like dive into that just a bit more to understand what you think can support us, what might have helped you to be more comfortable interviewing somebody and actually having it recorded, because it can feel overwhelming at times.
Yeah, maybe it feels contrived or something like that. So first of all, it's me personally that felt initially that I was awkward behind the mic and I wasn't sure exactly what to say, and I wanted to stick with the questions, and sort of the concern was around, am I looking good? Am I hearing? Do these questions sound stupid? Is this engaging? And as opposed to being in the conversation and in the moment with the conversation, you're self-analyzing and you're busy judging yourself. And so I think that's key. Look, you want to have fun with it. You want to enjoy it. Okay, so it goes back to that. And so if you enjoy it, it's going to not just resonate with your guests, but it's probably going to resonate with people listening to it, and it's going to resonate with you in the conversation, right? So, I mean, that's what I would say personally. I started by interviewing friends of mine that I thought were very interesting, and they had some interesting backgrounds, and they had podcasting experience. So one of the first people that I interviewed was a guy by the name of Mike Mahler, who was the first person to sort of bring kettlebell training into the US. And he's a really good friend of mine. And he had a podcast for a while, and he interviewed like Ken Shamrock and all these other MMA guys, and he trains MMA guys. So he understood the medium. So I hopped on a call with him, and he had his own way of doing things. He didn't wear headphones. He sort of was super off the cuff, and I enjoyed it. I enjoyed the conversation. I learned from it. I also felt like it sort of went in all types of different directions, and perhaps having it be a bit more relevant to whatever topic so that there's takeaways was probably something that was missing from that conversation. And all of us, especially me, I think what I need to work on is to take away, what was the person that you said you listened to his podcast a lot, the real estate?
Bill Fairless.
Bill Fairless, yeah. So to me, that's where I could learn from Bill. So I'm going to listen to his podcast and like really understand how he drives that sort of value, right? Because the way that I tend to go in my podcast is maybe to talk a little bit too much about the personal side. And there may be some guests out there that may want to hear more about how the guest built XYZ, and maybe not so much about why they went off and mountain biked or like went cliff diving, right? So there is that balance, but ultimately you can't get too caught up in that, right? I think ultimately you want to have an interesting conversation. You want to drive value. You want to learn what makes the person tick. And me personally, when I've listened to interviews with people that I admire, for me to learn more about them as people allows me to get more interest, like more perspective on how they accomplished what they did. And mainly it's just like, you learn that, well, not just pretty much, we're all the same. We all have the same experience in life. We may have our own ways that we sort of perceive things, but ultimately we all deal with the same stuff. So if I could introduce somebody that is successful and I admire, and also show that they are just like you and I, and they just have certain ways that they do things that allowed for them to see success, I think that gives sort of a formula. And ultimately, what I think really works is if I can have a guest sort of vulnerable about what it is that was difficult for them, or what it is that was challenging for them, because everybody goes through that. And to really understand the challenge will get you to understand how they succeed, as opposed to just looking at how success happened, right?
Several insights that can be pointed out from your way of seeing how we can become a little bit more comfortable behind the mic. The one that I recognize the most, and I definitely see it being valuable to a newer podcaster, is that we kind of just have to stop worrying about criticizing ourselves. Stop stressing about how do we sound right now? Was that a dumb question? And get more into the conversation with our hearts and our minds, and enjoying the conversation and thinking about less about ourself and how we sound. And I definitely think that that is super valuable. Alex Atwood from Off the Clock. You should scroll down, grab his bio, check him out, check out Off the Clock. And if you leave an honest written rating review, let him know you heard about him here. All right. We are jumping off. Thank you, Alex.
Thank you, Adam. Good to see you, man.
You too, brother. If you're glad that you checked out the podcast today, if you got some value out of this episode, some actionable takeaways, I invite you to do one of three things. A, you could do a written review on Apple. Let us know what you think. Just an honest written review. B, you could share the podcast with a friend of yours who needs it. Or C, at the very least, implement what you've learned to take your business and your podcast to the next level. And I'll see you on the next episode.